Hello friends, welcome back. Hope you're doing well. In today's video, I'm in Luminar Neo and I'm going to talk about a masking mistake that I see a lot of beginners make that is super easy to avoid and it's incredibly important and easy to do. Let's jump into it. I've got a gray sheet of paper here. I'm going to take the exposure all the way to the left and make it a black sheet of paper, and I'm going to go into masking and brush. Now what I want to do first is, if you notice this little slider here called softness, you will see that the circle, which represents my brush, is a complete circle. And I'm going to go ahead and just paint this on, and you'll see that's what it's done to the photo. Now in comparison, I'm going to take softness to 100. And if you look now, it's essentially two different circles because the inner circle gets us effectively 100% of what I'm going to mask or paint in. And between that inner ring and outer ring, it starts to fade from 100% down to 0%. And so when you mask in like that, you get a lot more subtle implementation of a mask. Now, I sent this out in my newsletter recently. In fact, the last two newsletters, I've talked about this idea, what's called softness or feathering of a mask, and how and why it's so important. And I'm going to show you that as real life examples in a couple of different photos and also with a couple of different masking styles. But the difference being that this hard edge, and I say hard edge because this top one, softness is 0, therefore if softness is 0, hardness is 100. So hard edge, you get 100% all the way to the edge, and then you get 0%. So there's no transition, there's no gradient. Gradient is generally the term that's used. There's no feathering, no softness, right? Whereas down here, where softness is 100, it's a very soft mask. So as you can see, it blends very favorably and very gently into the rest of the photo. Let me explain and show you why this is so critically important. Now, I've got this photo here previously been edited, and what I want to do is go into develop, and all I'm going to do is just move the colors really high, in fact, too high, simply because I want it to be super visible. Saturation and vibrance of 100. Actually, I just can't even look at that. How about we make it 50? And then I'll make it 50 here as well. So 50 of saturation and vibrance, still too much, but I want to show you the difference in the quality of your results based on those different mask settings. So I'm going to go into brush and softness of 100. Let me make this mask really big, or this brush, and I'll just paint this in here, something about like that. And you can see I've got an area where there's a higher concentration of saturation, and it kind of fades into kind of nothing, for lack of a better term, right? So keep that in mind. And just to look at the numbers, I did 50 on saturation, 50 on vibrance. Now I've got the same photo here with the exact same previously edited settings. And what I want to do is go in and do 50 on saturation and 50 on vibrance and show you the difference by using a hard brush and why this is so critically important. So 50 there, and I'm going to come over here and say 50. Boom. There we go. Currently applying across the entire photo, as you know. Brush and softness of 0. So a very hard mask, hard edge mask. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to paint this in. And when I let go, it's incredibly obvious what that difference is. The difference between where the mask is applying and where it's not applying is a very abrupt switch. Or very abrupt transition, what I like to call a light switch transition. Instantaneously, it goes from, hey, all this color, this saturation and vibrance, to 0. Whereas, and you can even see this in the thumbnail, right? Whereas over here, yes, 50 is too much, and I don't recommend going that high. I'm using it for visual example, but you can't see a hard edge there, and you do see a hard edge here, right? So soft brush, hard brush. Now, you may think, well, yeah, Jim, but at 50, it's just too much. So don't use 50, Jim, and that's very true. I don't recommend using 50. But if I come in and reduce the numbers, you're still going to have a visible line along the edge of that mask. So let's go into this develop that I used. There's color, and there's the 50. Let's call that 20. And I will call this 20 as well, 20. And you can still see that line right there. So even though I've gone to a more normal level of saturation or vibrance, you still that because that hard edge, there's no transition, you still see that line in your photo. Whereas over here, where I use that brush at softness of 100, I'm going to go in, here we go, and go into color and take this down to 20, just like I did in the last photo, 20 and 20. And there, now, if you look at that, you can still see that there's a little bit more color here. And however, you don't have that abrupt change. And in some ways, it's a little bit hard to tell exactly where does the color start getting more vibrant, more colorful, and where does it end because of that fade or that blend or that transition along the edge. It's incredibly important in masking because you might think, well, it's one thing, you're not really going to notice that. But if you're doing the same brush stroke with a hard brush, even if it's a 10 or 15 or even maybe less than 10, but you're doing some stuff around light and then detail and then some color, as you start to add these edits or stack these edits with that hard brush, it becomes more and more and more noticeable because you're effectively doubling down on that hard brush. And so the difference between where the brush is applying and where it's not becomes more and more glaringly obvious. Whereas with a soft brush, you have that gentle transition and you're able to mask, no pun intended, your edits a bit more easily in the photo, which means your viewer has a better viewing experience, you have a better overall edit, and you don't have any abrupt changes in color or light or detail from one spot to another. It blends very favorably and very beautifully, and that's why that's so important. I'm going to show you a couple more examples of how this works. By the way, if you haven't subscribed to my newsletter, I actually give away a couple of free things. There's a Luminar Neo Quick Start Guide, and I've also got a Quick Start Bundle that I give away for free. There's a link down below if you want to check those out. It's a great way to get you up and running with Luminar with my 27-page free guide, and also a couple of different preset packs, some skies, some textures, and some LUTs to play with to let your creativity run wild. Check that out if you're interested, link down below. Now, I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to go back to saturation of 50 and vibrance of 50. And what I want to do here is talk about some other masking types. There's a linear gradient. You will see that a linear gradient allows you to draw a line. And this is the gradient zone. And that's why I called that feathering or softening earlier. I also called it a gradient. That's what it is. You're fading it gradually from 100% of the edit to 0. And so the greater the gradient, the wider the gradient, the more gradual that fade is in the color, in this case across the photo. Whereas if you put this really tightly like that and then back out and take a look at it, you see an abrupt line. Well, that looks terrible and nobody would want that. So I'm going to go back and do this with a generous fade so that you can see how this looks, even at 50, which is honestly a little bit high. But now I can draw this gradient, fade it into the rest of the photo gently over a larger area. And now you take a look at it, and sure, it's still a little high. 50 is too high, but you don't have that abrupt line where it's drawn across the photo and makes your edit really obvious. And same thing is true, of course, with a radial gradient. I'm going to make this 50 again. So 50 there and then 50 here. And now I'm going to get a radial gradient. And these are just incredibly important. This is your gradient zone between the two circles, just like on my brush. You can shape this and move it around and do all kinds of things. But if you pull this in and collapse that, that's where you get that hard edge. And you don't want that. You want that gradient zone so that it transitions smoothly across the rest of the image. Now, this is also true in other things like luminosity masks. And I talk about these a lot because I love them and they're incredibly important. But a luminosity mask is masked based on light value. But you can also feather these masks. And so dragging these two ends allow you to select the tones that you want contained within your mask. In other words, the mask is going to be built around the tones that are inside this rectangle, and the tones that are on the left and on the right are excluded. But the ability to fade it is incredibly important because you can see up here, there's a fairly hard edge like right there where it just abruptly stops. Here in the sand, it just abruptly stops. These little triangles are your friends, and as you see as I'm dragging them, you'll see that it's starting to fade into those darker areas. And then if I grab it this way towards the highlights, it starts to fade that as well. And you can see that in the mask. And so again, that's your transitional zone or your gradient zone. And being able to do this on a mask is incredibly important because it gives you a lot smoother transition. And again, too much color because I'm at 50, but 15 might be reasonable here, and maybe 15 on the vibrance as well. But the bottom now looks pretty nice, right? So before and after, it just gives you nice control. And again, it's because I have that smooth transition. Now here's another example where this comes into play on not just the other masks that I've already talked about, brush, linear gradient, radial gradient, and luminosity mask, but it also comes in handy on Mask AI and Object Select because these two masks masking types. They're AI based, so they identify things or regions. Like Mask AI will identify the sky for me, and that's great. The thing is, if I click sky and choose it, you will notice around these edges, it's not exactly perfectly crisp. It kind of softens up a little bit. Now, this has gotten better over time, but you want to be careful, because if you're coming in and let's say I'm going to do this, make it really obvious, you can see here, if I drop this exposure, you end up getting these halos. Now, again, you're not going to drop the exposure that much. I'm doing this for, let's call it dramatic effect, just to make it easier for you to see. But what I recommend doing is, if you do use Mask AI or Object Select, also coming in on top of that with a brush at a lower strength, because that's effectively a gradient zone, and then you can come in here and kind of paint that in around some of these edges. And I recommend going a lot slower and a lot more zoomed in than I am. But if you paint that in along these edges, what you're doing is you're creating that gradient zone, that transitional zone, and you're lessening the effect. Now, again, it's way too dark, but that's a way to help you kind of smooth over the fact that that edge is not perfect and give you a little bit more control over those AI masks. And so I use all these different kind of tools in combination, because this is how you get a really controlled edit done. But for me, the most important thing, and one of the biggest mistakes I see in masking, is not paying attention to those gradient edges and making them either too compressed, like in a linear gradient or a radial gradient, or using a hard edge like in a brush. Really just, I think, not a good idea if you want to have a nice smooth edge and a controlled edit where you don't have these abrupt changes in color or tone or detail across your photo. That's how I go about doing it in Luminar Neo. Hope this has given you some ideas and gives you some help in masking in your own photos. Check out my free user guide and free quick start bundle down below if you want to check those out. And I'll be back soon with more videos, my friends. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and until next time, adios.